Welcome to Judaism Demystified, a podcast for the perplexed. Join us as we explore some of the most fascinating Jewish and Torah-related topics with our esteemed guests. By tackling some of the biggest questions you likely won't find addressed elsewhere, we aim to shed light on important issues and inspire a return to the fundamentals. Enjoy the show. Thank you, Rabbi Zarum, for joining the Judaism Demystified podcast. We are huge fans of yours and your new book, Questioning Belief. Bensi, if you could hold up the book. This is one of the best books, maybe the best book we read in 2024, and we really want everybody to get this book and read it, and you'll understand why after this podcast. So before we get into the themes and the chapters of this book, we wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about yourself and also what inspired you to write this book.
Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here on your podcast, and I applaud what you do and dealing with challenging issues. So a little bit about me. I've got an unusual background. I'm kind of half British and half Yemenite, but I brought up in the British Jewish community. And as a teacher of Torah and an academic, I get many people asking me fundamental questions about science, about the nature of the Torah. And so much so, and with my scientific background, I felt the need. It was a good idea to respond in an honest, non-triumphalist way, in a way that respected the questions and told the reader it's okay to ask these things. And instead of giving, simplistic or spurious answers, I wanted to give ones that were based on the best Jewish sources I could find, and also based on modern literary and archaeological readings of the Torah to help. And so after a number of years slogging, I came up with Questioning Belief. That's the story.
Excellent, excellent. So we want to just get right into it, if that's okay. We couldn't pick which are the most important chapters. I think they're all very important, but we kind of figured that the ones that, the foundational ones are the ones we're going to go through this podcast. So we're going to start with the first chapter, which is creation at odds with modern science? So could you just expand on that?
Yes, so many people have discussed this issue of how do you fit in 7 days of creation with clearly 13.5 billion years, which is the age of the universe we know from science. And people kind of try and mesh the two together, make it fit, and kind of give different answers for that. The approach I wanted to give is to understand how to read the Torah. It was never meant to be a history or science book. It was meant to teach us how to live in this world. And therefore, it's written for human beings, and specifically at Mount Sinai when the people received the Torah. So the way the Torah is described in the first chapter, again, is not about science. It's to explain a human role in the world. And so I give a number of different readings to the purpose of this. One of them is the ordering, because the ordering also doesn't fit with science. That's what's so interesting. Even if you say that, 7 days is millions of years, and there's kind of hodgepodge ways you might try and do that, it's out of order. Doesn't make sense. You've got the wrong ordering. So the ordering must have a different purpose. And I explained it's about the human being's role in the world. So first we describe the things that are way outside of us in space, and then in the skies and the seas, and then finally on Earth. And it brings to us at the center here. Another aspect of it I talk about is its rejection of idolatry. What do I mean by that? So lots of words in chapter 1 are actually similar to ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian languages about the gods, the god of the sea, Mamu, or of the abyss, Tahom, or different ones. And each one of those, what the Torah does is it demystifies. It's very good for your title. It demystifies and says they aren't mystical, divine beings. They're just objects that God made. So also chapter 1 rejects that. So I try and show what the real purpose of it. I bring Jewish sources from the Rambam and previous and more modern to show that you're allowed to read it in this non-literal way and to understand the deeper purpose of what it's there for. And so when you read that text in its rightful way, it makes more sense as an introduction. It's telling you what's your place in creation, what's your purpose here. Just one aspect of it, the most speculative bit, but I always like mentioning it, is why 7 days? Where does the 7 come from? And it's a great question when you think about it, because the number 7 isn't natural. Why? Because if you landed on a desert island, you wouldn't know what day of the week it was. You wouldn't know there are 7 weeks. You know the time of the day because you can look up at the sky and see the sun rising and setting. And if you can make a sundial, you know what time of the day it is. You know what time of the month it is, what day of the month, because if you know how the moon waxes and wanes, you can determine where you are in the monthly cycle. And if you're really good at reading the stars, you can actually tell from looking at the planets and how they move where we are in the year, in the cycle of the year. But you can't work out the day of the week or the idea of weeks just by looking up at the sky. So where do the 7 days of the week come from? So some try to argue it's a kind of simplistic version of the month, 30 days, 4 times 7, it's a bit like 28. But then you get out of sync very quickly. And the naming of the days, Lundi, Mardi, Mercredi in French, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, which are based on gods, that's also very late. So where did it come from? And my suggestion is, and this is from a close reading, because in day 4, where it talks about that the sun and moon are in order to count time for the days and the months and the years, what it doesn't mention in the pasuk is weeks. It's so interesting. It doesn't mention Shavuot. So it seems that actually the 7 isn't about looking up and so on. The 7 might be something else. And so I try to look in nature where you find 7. And one approach is hexagonal packing in chemistry, which is quite an interesting approach. But more interesting, and I found other people written about this, is there are 7 cavities or holes in a human person's head, right? 2 ears, 2 eyes, 2 nostrils, and a mouth. There are 7 holes. And those holes are how we interact with our world, allow our consciousness, how we see, how we smell, how we taste, how we hear. And so the 7 could be paralleling human consciousness as why we've chosen that 7. I don't know. It's very speculative, but I try and give an explanation of why I don't have why you might need to find the answer of why there are 7. So for me, studying Genesis chapter 1, it's not just to make you be able to go to bed and sleep and say, oh, religion and science don't contradict. I'm not interested in that. There's no point in that. I'm trying to understand what is the true depth of the Torah. What is this chapter 1 trying to teach us? It's clearly not history or science. So as I've shown you, it's about human place in the world and their interaction with it. Now, I haven't solved everything. There's still many questions I have. Why focus on Tanin Gedolim, the great sea creatures? That's a great question. And this is an ongoing exploration to try and work it out. But I trust the Torah. I trust its depth. And if we analyze it, there are deeper understandings that we're going to get of how to make sense of it.
And we see that the Chachamim concur with this approach to the extent that we don't learn Maaseh Bereshit alone, right? Already giving it a sort of a mysterious status, in that it's not straightforward that someone could just pick it up and just start learning it. It is something that needs to be delved into.
Yeah, absolutely. You're referring to the Gemara Chagiga, where it says Maaseh Bereshit, Genesis chapter 1, and Ezekiel chapter 1. Maaseh Merkavah can't be understood in simple ways, as you say, can't be studied in large groups, only with individuals or great teachers.
Oh, I said alone mistakenly. Yes, yeah.
No, it's fine, it's fine. Well, what's interesting is that our scientific knowledge today is so advanced that actually we need to respond. Only certain people would have known about it back then, the rabbis, but now. And when I study with people, often they might not be very Jewish literate, but they know their science and they understand rationalism much better than many people would have done hundreds of years ago. And so we need to give those responses. But as you say, the rabbis did open the door and say, do it, but do it carefully and seriously. I rewrote this chapter many, many times. As soon as you start saying some of the Torah is not literal, you could give the impression that you value it less. For me, I value it more. I don't take it simply literally. I take it very seriously, and that's how I look at it.
And I think that there's a confusion today with people in that taking something seriously today for a lot of people translates into reading it literally, where that is actually the opposite of how it's supposed to go. Meaning when it's almost like if you say like, don't take this literally, it's almost like we're not being serious with the text, when in reality, it's actually taking the text super seriously, right? And trying to uncover the deeper understanding within a text, because the literal understanding is not going to do that.
Well, I'll give you an example of how that plays out really quite well, which is Adam and Eve. You see, if you can take Adam and Eve literally if you want to, commentaries do that, but the Rambam and many others say it's symbols of the beginning of humankind. But when I think about it, you see, if you take it exactly literally, that Adam and Eve were real people who had personalities and individual lives, then there might be models, they might have moral lessons that I can learn from, but they're them and I'm me. We're different people. I can learn messages. But if Adam and Eve is HaKadosh Baruch Hu, if God's description of what it means to be human, male and female, then I'm not a bit like Adam. I am Adam. And every word and every letter that's described there is HaKadosh Baruch Hu trying to teach me what it means to be human. And so I take it much more seriously. And I don't want to just learn quaint vortelach about how to be a kind person. Abraham listened to his wife, Adam listened to Chava, Eve, or Eve, Chava didn't respond, and it's human relationships. That's simplistic. No, they're describing the nature of all interactions, and that every time we're interacting, we are replaying Adam and Eve. So again with Cain and Hevel, same story. Is it just Cain kill Hevel? No. Every time a human kills another, it is Cain killing Hevel again. We're going through that text again. It becomes relevant every day for our lives because these characters are the model that HaKadosh Baruch Hu set up for us to understand what it means to be human and how to interact with each other. So I have to read it. I have to understand every part of it. That's why it's not just, as you say, non-literal is taking it much more seriously.
I think in the More 230, the Rambam discusses that Adam represents the soul, Chava represents the body, the snake represents desire, and Cain and Hevel, like you said, are like components of the soul. So this is not something that's kind of new to, this isn't like a modern twist that we're putting on, but the Rishonim felt very comfortable, Ralbag, they felt very comfortable having these conversations. So I think today there's a lot of taboo around it for whatever reason. And it's
the reason's important. We should discuss that bit. The reason is because once you open the door and say some of it's not literal, where does it end? Right. It's opening Pandora's box.
Measure. It's a protective measure.
Exactly. But the irony is that it's. I once someone said to me, but surely very religious Jews take it all seriously. And I was like, no, you're not allowed to take it literally. Right? Ein tachat ein, shen tachat shen in Shemot, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. The Gemara says you mustn't take it literally. You have to read it as monetary compensation. So we're actually given examples in law where we mustn't take it literally. And anyone who studied Gemara, the legal aspects of Torah, actually sees how often we don't take it literally. I'm going through the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam at the moment. We did the story of the accusation of the Sota and other things as well. And the Rambam keeps saying, we don't literally mean they did that. What it means is a process of law went through and the witnesses and so on. So the more you learn Talmud, the more you see that to take it simplistically is not. You have to understand what's really going on. And the same applies for the stories as well. But I understand some people are afraid once you open Pandora's box, where does it end? Right? How much will we not take literally? Did Abraham not exist? Did Moses not exist? And so I looked, and I mentioned in the book with Sajja Gon and others about what are the rules of literal and non-literal. When do you take it literal? When do you not? And that is quite sophisticated, and that helps you understand how to read a text.
I would also refer the listeners to the Igeret Triat HaMetim of Harambam, for also there he talks about when to take things literally or not literally, quite in detail. So both this Rav Sadia,
I think it's in that one where he begins by, because he wrote that because he was being accused of not believing in something, right?
So
he says at the beginning, one of my favorite bits, he says that you can always misunderstand someone if you want to. Right? If your intention is to misunderstand someone and get at them, you can. He gives the example of, and he does it, it's amazing. He says, I will read the Trinity, the Christian belief in, three parts of God into the Shema. And he goes, how? Shema Yisrael, Hashem, 1, Elokeinu, 2, Hashem, 3, is Echad. 3 is 1. And to read the Rambam 800 years ago, to write that, to kind of, he's showing you, oh, look, I can see Christianity in the Shema, is just unbelievable. I get a nice smile when I read it, but he's doing that to show you, see, look, if you're trying to attack me, you can read anything you want, but read honestly, and let me explain to you what things really mean, as you say.
Absolutely. And he was defending himself against accusations that he doesn't hold a Zchut HaMetim. Part of that was him needing to prove why he doesn't take the psukim regarding Zchut HaMetim, why he does not read it non-literally over there.
Mm,
That's part of him trying to prove that he holds of it. He has to explain why he actually does take those psukim literally. And so
mm.
it's into all the rules of when to take literally, not literally. So in the spirit of what you said before, it's an excellent resource for categorization of literal and non-literal and putting parameters and borders around it.
And I
So
think most people will look at a lot of psukim in the Torah and naturally just their instinct is to not read it literally, which would be like God's feet made of sapphire. I don't think anybody tries to make an argument. I don't think people really think that when Hashem took us out on the wings of eagles from Egypt, that literally happened. So
Mm.
so I think that the rabbis already, the Chachamim already established that this is Maaseh Bereshit. Maaseh Bereshit, that is something in a different category.
Yeah.
So I think they already made they drew the boundary already. So I think it's fair game, like you mentioned, to treat these psukim this way.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it goes further than just you say chapter 1, because then I mean, well, Maaseh Bereshit might go all the way to chapter 4.
Right,
But as you know, in a later chapter, I talk about the flood as well. So some have argued that actually it's the first 11 chapters that have it. So chapter 1 has a special status, Maaseh Bereshit, Maaseh Merkava, as you say, but also the first 11 chapters. So I think it's the Rabbi Bachya on that last pasuk of chapter 11 with the final nun of Haran is a very large nun, and he explains there's a kind of gap, a change in the world that goes on at that time. And I think in the Gemara of Avodah Zarah, it talks about the world will be 6,000 years, 2,000 of Bria, of creation, and 2,000 of Torah, and then 2,000 Mashiach. That also there's stages that it changes. So I've always seen those first 11 chapters, and again, my teacher Rabbi Sacks talks about this, have a different feel. And you see Chazal, as I give an example in the Gemara and medieval, hinting about that as well.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I see it the same exact way. I think you see a dramatic shift in almost everything once you get to Avraham. And everything from before that, it's almost like we're talking about an alternate universe from the standpoint of people living till 1,000 years old, and just the entire feel of what's going on reads. It doesn't even. I'm not trying to say, God forbid, that it's just not literal. We're talking about something. There's elements of truth for sure in there, and I think you'll talk about that a little bit regarding the flood, right? Like, was there a flood? Was there not a flood? What kind of flood it was, right? But like just taking everything literally without seeing those first 11 chapters as speaking to something much more that we have to delve.
Well, I think you see in the character, if you read how, if you just imagine trying to act Noah, if you got an actor in and say, there's not much for me to work with here. He says he doesn't say very much. He doesn't respond to God. He doesn't seem to have an inner life.
Yeah.
Whereas Avraham and Sarah are portrayed with more dimensions. They've got personalities. They're drawn with much more rich color. You just feel that through reading the text. And so clearly you're meant to be looking at it slightly differently.
You say it so well. I try to say it and it comes out horrible, and he says it goes perfect. Okay. All right. So we'll go on to chapter 2 of your book, where you talk about evolution, which is a very important topic. Evolution and whether it makes the whole Genesis narrative redundant.
Yes, so this is an interesting one. And look, I studied physics in university. I did a PhD in theoretical physics, and that was my area. So that relates to chapter 1. But I'd never really studied evolution. And I got to thinking, like, are we allowed to believe in evolution? Like the whole point of chapter 1, it talks about the luminot. God made each species separately, which seems to be the exact opposite of evolution, one thing evolving from another. So I began reading Darwin's book and books about Darwin to understand. And the more I read, the more I was, first of all, blown away. He's such a brilliant writer, and I recommend to everyone reading his book, The Origin of Species. There's no equations in it. At the end of each chapter, he summarizes what he's saying, and it's really, really clear. And it was a deeper understanding of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Because Darwin's explanation is that each species had the power to evolve into others, which requires a greater HaKadosh Baruch Hu, greater God to do that, I think. Rabbi Sacks said it brilliantly in one line. He said, the Creator made creation creative, that could evolve one species into another. So then the question comes, why does the Torah seem to say, each one separately? So I think the two big issues are, people think that Darwin explained how life began, and that's not the case. It doesn't say, his book is not called The Origin of Life. It's The Origin of Species. So he says, once we've got a few basic species, I can tell you how they evolved into the plethora of billions of life forms we have today. But it doesn't say how life actually began. And he actually writes in his diary, I put this in the book, that trying to work out how life began, how we got life from non-life, will be as crazy and as impossible as working how you get matter from non-matter. So he actually admits, I've got no idea about that.
Yeah.
What I'm telling you is, though, is how they evolved. And when you look at the Malbim, based on other Midrashim, there is a hint that actually that's what's going on in chapter 1 as well. That it says the species we have on each day is now this. But there are Midrashim that show that one builds one from the other. And for me, that deepens my appreciation of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It doesn't weaken it. Another aspect that upsets people with Darwin is it's called random selection. You know, randomness seems to be the opposite of providence, of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what's going on. But I mean, what I like to say is that, you know, HaKadosh Baruch Hu does chaos, randomness for breakfast. That it might look like randomness to us, but there's actually a deep order to it. And that's not just a metaphor that people like to give of, they give of like a Persian rug, that, you know, underneath it all looks like a mess, but on the strings, but on the top you see the pattern. So God can see the pattern, but we can't. It's actually true on a scientific level. Well, when Darwin said it was random, he didn't mean it was pure random. Okay, so when I roll a dice, people think it's random. I can get what number 1 to 6. In pure mathematics or physics, if you understood it really, it is determinate. You can work it out. If you knew the exact way that you let go of the dice and the exact way the air resistance happened on the dice and its relative weight, with a lot of calculations, you could probably predict what number it would land on based on how you began with it. But the equations are so complex, the amount of factors you would need are so large that effectively you can't work it out. So we call it random. And that's what Darwin was saying. He said it's indeterminate. It's too many complex things. I can't work it out. It's effectively random. It's not really on the deepest level. And that leaves room for Kodesh Baruch Hu. So the more I studied it, the more I didn't see it was contentious, what Darwin was saying and what the Torah was saying. In fact, I saw it as quite supportive. And Darwin never wanted to upset people. You know, he was going to be a priest. And then he went on the Beagle and spent 5 years studying and developed his theories. And he was a religious man. He walked every week to church with his wife. Now, when he got older, he stopped. And the reason was much more to do with the death of his child from disease than from his philosophy, his science. Okay? He had difficult issues with God, like why would God allow violence and that kind of stuff? Because he didn't have midrash like we do to understand it. But he stopped going to church really more because he was very upset about the death of his daughter, and he was upset with God with that. And many people, Jews as well, get upset with God about those kind of things. So he would walk his wife to church and then sit outside. You know, I imagine what I call doing security. You know, he did the security, he went outside it. But the fact that he writes about this shows that he was not trying to upset religious people. He was just trying to understand the way science works, and that science and Torah can go hand in hand. And I don't know if you know this, but when he was buried, the pallbearers, the carriers of his coffin, were the greatest scientists and theologians of his day, together carrying it as a way of showing that, you know, he wasn't trying to unpick religion. He respected it. And so I honestly got a real affinity to Charles through reading about him. And in the chapter in the book where I describe the ideas, I talk about his life as a way of discussing these issues.
Very interesting. And I think people write off often, it happens very often, that you just write people off or write off ideas because of our own preconceived notions.
Yeah.
And what we've been told, let's say, but I totally agree with you. I think it's very worthwhile to explore his work.
But I have to tell you, I had a rabbi in yeshiva, and when I asked him about evolution, he said, anyone who thinks that we descended from apes probably did. Right? Which is so I laughed and I said, great joke. Is that it? And he goes, yeah, that's it. I was like, that's not enough. I mean, it's a good joke, but it's not enough. You can't answer in that way. You know, a young person who did biology at university or just goes on the internet for 5 minutes and reads, sees that, you know, the main understanding of biology today is evolution theory. And you can't just dismiss it with a joke. So you've got to take it seriously.
So how would you try to work it out with the Torah? How would you approach it?
So I'd say you have to a real understanding of what the Torah is saying with the Midrash and what its intention is, and then a proper understanding of evolution theory and the purpose of it. And the more you study the two together, you see they're not trying to clash. They've got different aims, and actually they marry in very important ways. We start off with simple species and get more complex ones, which is exactly how Darwin describes it. That there's a lot that goes hand in hand. So my approach is to not run away from these things and try and find just a cute answer to solve it. Because if someone goes, "Oh, I heard a lecture from Rabbi, it's all fine now," that for me disrespects science and Torah. I just want to sleep at night. I'm not interested in that. I'm like, I want to understand the world better. God gave us Maaseh Bereshit, God's works, and God gave us the Torah, God's words. The two, by definition, can't contradict because they're both from God. So if I think they contradict, I don't understand one or the other, which means I need to understand them more and take them more seriously. So I would love more people. I had one idea when I was younger to kind of put on a white shirt and go into lots of yeshivas and teach basic science to help people just think more clearly. The scientific knowledge it's really helpful. You think methodologically, it's helpful for us. You shouldn't be afraid of it. It can deepen our Torah. We had there was a famous Dayan in London called Dayan Ehrentroy. He was like a great Dayan of the London Met and very respected. And a friend of mine who's a professor of biology would sometimes see him at the back of a conference, a medical conference. He'd be sitting there, Dayan, listening. Why? Well, he said, well, if I need to if I need to make decisions on halakhic issues, I need to understand medicine. And ask these questions, I need to understand the physics of the world and the biology. So he would study it to an extent. And I think that's an important thing to realize. We should love, and for me, it's upsetting when people don't know what evolution theory is or Einstein's theory of relativity. I'm not talking about doing a degree in it, but just, a couple of, television programs worth of basic knowledge of basic physics, basic biology. Deepens your understanding, I think, deepens your understanding of God's world and appreciation of it. But also it's fundamental to being an educated human being. How can you not?
Yeah, this is exactly the topic we explored in one of our early episodes, I think episode 5 or 6, with Sina Kahan from the Chabura. We were talking about this false dichotomy that's created by people, like where, the world of science and the world of Torah cannot be, mixed. And really, the truth is that the author of the Torah is the author of the world, and we cannot, we cannot separate these two things. And why do we do that? Like you said, and he said it as well, it's fear. For whatever reason, people just, and there are good reasons, I'm sure, but there is this fear that people have of, potentially maybe going quote unquote off the derech. I think that's the fear that people have. And I don't think that that's necessarily true. I think that the case you just made is an excellent one, and that's what we stand for as well. I think our podcast is all about getting people to understand that science and Torah go hand in hand, and they only enlighten us on our tradition. And one thing that you bring up the Midrash. Interestingly, the Midrash points out a lot of fascinating things. Like, for example, it says there are 974 generations that predated Adam, or there were phases of the creation of Adam, like different hours of the day, different parts of the body were created, right? These are all amazing, like kind of springboards into ideas that can potentially kind of mix with what you're talking about here with evolution. So that's just one example.
Yeah, no, the Midrashim are interesting, what the rabbis are trying to do there, because, the Rambam says if it's a halakhic issue or an issue of nevuah, then Torah learning is how we study it. But if it's about the world around, he says very clearly the rabbis didn't necessarily know better than the Chochmei Umot Ha'olam, than the wise people of the general world, and therefore we can learn from them, gain wisdom from wherever you can. So it's the marrying of the two that's so interesting. Right, of how they go. So you're right. So when the rabbis learn out these little midrashim, these little nuggets, it makes you think, how does that relate to science? And again, it's not making it fit with science, but what could it suggest? And people have had some mystical and quantum interpretations. I'm fascinated by those. They're fun, but I always like to go back to the raw basic stuff. So how do we understand 7 days of creation? How do we understand evolution with understanding of the world today? Can they sit comfortably with each other? And I try and show in the book that they really can.
Absolutely. And, there's definitely you can see kind of an evolutionary pattern in the text when like up to the creation of Adam, it's kind of happening in an evolutionary manner where we get, like lower forms of life to Adam, all those stages, then there's like the animals right before Adam. So we can kind of see it work. It's not like it can't work.
And also you'd expect if the whole point is that humans are fundamentally different, because Darwin in his first book didn't want to write about human evolution. He knew it would upset people. And so he left it for a later book, The Descent of Man. He just talked about higher forms, because to say that man evolved as well is difficult, right? I mean, the only ever Jewish prime minister of England, of the United Kingdom, Disraeli, said, is man, an ape or an angel? And I'm my Lord on the side of the angels. He says he did even Disraeli, who wasn't a very religious Jew, had difficulty with the idea that humans evolved because we're fundamentally different. Now, in Torah, you think that as well. And yet, ironically, I love doing this, you ask people to write down what happened on each day of creation, a little test, children in the class, even adults. And they often get it wrong because they always assume that humans and animals are on different days. So they know Shabbat is 7, they know Adam is 6. So then they think, well, then it must be animals day 5, and they can't get everything to fit. Because the shock is that animals and humans are on the same day. And if the whole point is to show how unique humans are, how different humans are to other animals, the last thing the Torah should have done is put them on the same day, 2 stages. And the fact that it does that shows that they're interrelated and their words are similar. And Rav Soloveitchik talks about the link between the two, and the Ramban does as well. So clearly we are related to other animals around us. We're different. We evolved further. I always talk about, when it says in chapter 2 that God, blew that God blew into Adam the soul of life, and God blew into Adam. I go, does God have a mouth? Like, did God blow into Adam's mouth? Well, if God hasn't a mouth, then the verse isn't literal, okay? But God somehow got it inside him, right? Rabbi Rebbe points out it's the only time where God makes something inside. Everything is external, but that's the one thing that's internal, which is another level. And then I ask a simple question: how long did that take? Right? Was that 5 seconds, 2 minutes, 500,000 years? Once you're not literal, the day 6 is describing the gradual and brilliant and complex evolution of human species from more simpler forms. It's an amazing thing. It fits beautifully when you think in that way. So actually, it's a better understanding.
I would also point that the fact that Hashem tells Adam to name the animals perhaps points towards that relationship.
Yes. There's a midrash that says he names the animals, and then he says, "What do you call yourself?" There's a midrash. He goes, "I'm Adam," because I'm from Adamah. He says, "What am I?" And he says, "I'm God." Right, and then the midrash continues. It might be another midrash that all the animals try and worship Adam because they think he's God because he's clearly above them. And he goes, "No, let me show you who is God." And he takes them to do so. Adam's role is the kind of master and carer of carer of creation, and you get that from the story. And that's historically what humans are. So even, atheists or evolutionists who want to see that man is not fundamentally different to the other species, and they make this argument, that there's a difference, a degree, but not a difference of kind. The truth is, when I meet these people, I say, but you still don't treat animals like humans. You treat humans differently. We have a society, we have morality, and they all recognize that. So we know it's demonstrably true in our world. And the Torah is trying to explain to humans on the level we can of how that came to be.
And I would refer the readers because I think the best book that I've read on this topic, a full treatment of the topic, would be The Great Partnership by Rabbi Sacks.
Absolutely.
It is an absolute masterclass. And
but again, and it's interesting, and I'll make this point, he mentions Adam and Eve not being literal, but only about page 200. Because for Rabbi Sacks, he taught me how to write and how to teach. You don't say something unusual or surprising for the sake of it, to shock, right? Mm-hmm. Your aim is to explain how to live on this earth. If along the way you have to say things that are unusual, then you say them. You don't hide it. But you do it as part of your argument, not as the culmination of your argument. So absolutely, the great partnership. But you should know, he didn't originally want to write that. He was very aware of these misunderstandings people have. And so we all pushed them and said, but look, after the new atheists were writing these books, and I don't know if you know, in Britain, there was actually a stage where they had on buses, they hired buses, adverts to say, God probably doesn't exist, so just go on with your life. Like, it was a big issue. And so there was a felt need for someone to respond. And even though a few Christian theologians have written something, we all knew that the best writer would be Rabbi Sacks. So myself and many others encouraged him to, and he wrote that book. And I love it because and I told him it's a book about science for non-scientists, right? He's not a scientist.
Exactly. And in fact, I was brought up in a traditional yeshivish atmosphere, so I don't think I had a problem necessarily with science and Torah. I just didn't know how to go about it. You understand what I mean?
Yes.
So that book, when I read it, it really his way of writing it kind of leads you into it in such a graceful way that like you said, it's a book of science for non-science for people who don't understand science.
Mm.
And yeah, that's why I felt we should bring it up because it's a great book.
Yes,
Uh,
and it ultimately gives the purpose about freedom and morality and why we're here, which is the point of it. You know, there's the technicals along the way in the clashes, but why are we doing this? And he's always focused on that. So he's in my head as a pupil of his, in how I write and how I think.
And it's sad that people would attack Rabbi Sacks for doing this because really it brings me to the quote by Rav Kook, which is I might be misquoting it, but atheism cleanses the dross of petty religion, and
Mm.
and we wouldn't have without these atheists we wouldn't have to have such a refined understanding and response to these questions with our Judaism. Our Judaism has to be elevated now because the way we respond is
Mm.
directly to those issues that are being brought up. So I actually think that it's so important to tackle these issues because we live in a different time. We live in the 21st century with the age of information. We're constantly bombarded with things, and we need to have answers. It's no longer we can just brush things aside. And Rabbi
Sure,
Sacks,
yeah, I agree, but I think it's also fundamental to the way of learning. When you learn any topic, at first you think you understand it, then you go through a stage of actually things get pulled apart and then more complicated. I remember when we started doing smicha and the Dayan asked us, can you have a coffee in Starbucks? And we were like, yeah, of course. And then he said, why? And we all gave our reasons and he pulled them apart. And we're like, oh, can we not? He goes, we can, but not because of what you said. And then we began to relearn, properly understanding it. There's lots of misunderstanding. So the process of knowledge takes you further away from understanding at first
yes,
and then closer. In a medical operation, you cut somebody open at first and they get more ill technically at that moment if you left it. But then you tidy it up and you actually get better. So the process of learning always involves smashing beliefs that you had or simplest ideas. And we mustn't be afraid of that. And everyone knows that in yeshiva learning, that's the case of things. Someone comes out, she goes, I thought I understand a word, and they're not afraid of that. So why not the case with other subjects as well, right? With Torah as well.
It reminds me of the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he says, if you want to reach a higher point, you first have to bend your knees so that you can jump. You got to
Yeah.
go down a bit
Oh,
before
that's a lovely one. That's lovely.
yeah.
Well, Soloveitchik talks about it in terms of going over the hills. When you get close, you go down, but you're still nearer, but then you go up again. But I like that. You bend your knees to get the energy with which to jump.
Yeah.
That's very nice. That's very nice. I like that. It's like that. It's like latent energy. And when you heat up water, the temperature rises. And then at one point the temperature stops rising, even though you're heating it, because the energy is being used to jump from liquid to gas. It's called latent heat, I think. So it looks like nothing's happening, but it is. It's that jump. So I like the way you said with the Rebbe that it's,
beautiful.
you bend your knees to jump higher. Yeah. So we need to bend our knees more.
Gonna bend it.
So now to the next segment is, does the flood story still hold water? And I would add for the listeners, there are other flood epics that occurred in the ancient world. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the Atrahasis. So some can look at it as, there's a confirmation that something did happen.
Mm-hmm. And they're older than ours. They're older than ours.
And they're older than ours. And obviously the point of it, in my humble opinion, is that the Torah is trying to tell us something. It's not just about a historical event. So can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so that's one approach, that it's borrowing. I mean, that's the most extreme one. It's borrowing from another story that pre-existing to teach a moral lesson. That's a possibility. For me, the issue is that first is that no commentators seem to say so clearly that it wasn't literal.
Yeah.
Like where Adam and Eve and the snake, everyone was willing to. They weren't so much with the ark. And so I wondered why. And then I realized because of the knowledge they had then, the amount of species they thought were around then, they thought it could have fitted. In fact, there's some midrashim about, working out how large was each chamber in the ark and how could they all fit in. So the Chazal, rabbis' approach is you only take it non-literally if it can't be literal.
Yeah.
And that's what Sajagon talks about in his book Emunot V'Dayot, and I love the example he gives there. And I mentioned the book because he says, when it says that Chava why was she called Eve, Chava? Because she was Em Kol Chai, the mother of all life. Kol Chai, that's the pasuk says, Em Kol Chai. So does that mean Ibn Ezra says she gave birth to children and to antelopes and to birds and to plants because she's the mother of all life? He goes, well, obviously not. Kol there doesn't mean kol and kol, not all life, but all human life. So it's a qualification on the word kol from common sense. So I point out that the word kol occurs many, many times in the flood with the animals and with the earth and with many aspects of it. And that kol, just like Sajagon taught us, should be more limited. Now, he didn't need to talk about the flood because in his time, as I said, it could have happened. It would have made sense, the whole world. But we now, if you study just basic meteorology or understanding of water and so on and growth, it's just not possible. Of course, HaKadosh Baruch Hu can do it and make the whole world flood if God wanted to, but then put it back as if it never happened. I talk about this in the book. Why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu make it look as if it never happened? Leave bits behind that might imply that.
Yeah,
But
you're
HaKadosh Baruch Hu
forced
doesn't.
into a lot of mental gymnastics if that.
Right, exactly. You end up with a lot of weird stuff. So more likely is it's a localized event in a certain area. And coal is the known earth, the earth that we know. And that makes a lot more sense. And then I bring a bunch of midrashim that imply that the dead are actually all in that region from the bones and stuff from Mesopotamia. It didn't reach the land of Israel. It's a localized event. But then, and this is the next step, if it's a localized event, a regional event, why give the impression it's over the whole earth? So that's the drama of the story. I like to point out, I don't know in your shul when they announce what time mincha is, but in the very traditional shuls, they'd always say the oilam will be davening mincha at 7 p.m. The oilam is the world. Like, really? The world? The whole world? Right? Loads of shuls around the corner are not. But in that room, the oilam is the whole world, is everything. So the Torah is doing our perspective. It's the whole world. And it gives the drama of responsibility for all life, which is so relevant for today, which is why I really like it. Because the ark is a metaphor for life, and that every time species become extinct, not naturally, that's the way of the world, but because of human interaction, human destruction, then we're limiting the God's ark, and that's a very sad thing. So the message for me, it's a really strong environmental message of Noah's responsibility for the ark, and you see that from the midrashim. So I decided to try and read as many midrashim I could about the ark as possible. And there's a few that talk about its shape, but most of them are the moral lessons or how much Noah cared for each species, a broken wing of a bird or an animal not eating properly. It's all about care and love and chesed. And from that, Avraham learns the lesson of, chesed, how to be chesed as well. So it's actually chayin. So Noah is about chayin and Avraham is chesed. That's why we say chayin v'chesed v'rachamim. That's the evolution of care and consideration. So that's what the story is really about, caring for all of life. Human life, ultimately, but all life that we're responsible for. And that flood story is really about that. So that's why it does the drama of the whole world. But it's an unusual thing to argue. So I do go through the sources that the Ibn Ezra at one point actually says, it's dangerous to not take it as the whole earth. So I do analyze that. And when you give a logical argument, you should also look at the naysayers, the rejections, and say why you can explain those as well. So I make the effort. It's a long chapter, but to go through those different issues to explain it. And I don't want to just, shelve the flood. I want to make it what it's really meant to be about, a message about our responsibility to all life on earth.
I think it's so obvious if you do contrast it, compare and contrast it with those ancient epics, the Epic of Gilgamesh and Atrahasis, is that especially Noah's role. Noah, it puts the onus of responsibility on humanity, right? It's the sin of man, whereas in the ancient epics, it was about, the warring gods, and we are just the collateral damage of those warring gods. But in this specific case, we have it's all about the Hamas, right? The violence of man that leads to chaos and disorder, and God wanting, not wanting to, but having to start over again because of our actions. It's no longer, something that is just bad that's happening to us. And everything, the way the whole bringing in the rainbow and all these things, these are all just amazing lessons that I wouldn't be able to do justice right now. And I really love this chapter. I think this chapter is fascinating. And again, I want to keep plugging your book. I think our listeners will get a lot out of reading.
Well, thank you. I visit the British Museum very often, and those texts, the Atrahasis and unapishtim versions, are there. The original text that they found that shocked people. I mean, famously, George Smith, when he was analyzing this text, he translated it from the the Akkadian, was so shocked that he's a good Victorian, Christian living in late 1800s in the UK, and he reads this text. He was so shocked he almost stripped and ran around the museum shouting because he was so shocked that he'd found a story older than Noah. But I see in these stories that it's very relevant to me. And something historically you might be interested is that the first person to really write about these issues is Chief Rabbi Hertz in the Hertz Chumash. And I want you to realize why that's the case. Even though that it was published, the full version, 1927, he was already beginning to write it in the late 1800s. And what was happening is people in the British Museum, these discoveries were on the front page of newspapers. And they were going to the chief rabbi and saying, oh, but in the British Museum, there's a story of a previous character, or there's a Hammurabi code of another thing that's similar to the Torah. How do you explain this, chief rabbi? So his book was a response to what was the knowledge that was coming out at the time. That's what's so interesting. So that's why I felt the need, as Rabbi Sacks did, to update that knowledge for now, based on the science and the archaeology that we have today.
And I think that the Torah is being given to the ancient Israelites. And it does make sense to me that if the ancient Israelites are going to absorb certain ideas, and narrative is a very powerful tool to be able to absorb, especially ideas that are fundamental, that are of the human condition, yes, to use something that is already within their frame of reference and to be able to teach via that the lessons that are there. It makes sense to me that this would be an avenue for the Torah to take.
Yes, yes. I'm relaxed about saying whether there was a Noah or it was just learning from an Apishtim, because people hold on to literal or truth on different levels. Yeah. As you know, in the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, sometimes he says you mustn't take it literally. He's very angry if you take things literally about the midot of God. But sometimes he says if you want to believe this, you can. Sometimes you can believe it in this way, and he gives room, I think. So I've learned from him as well to do that, different levels of it. Whatever helps.
Right. My point wasn't to say that it didn't have. My point is that assuming there was some sort of event, like you said, a localized flood, it's still using the event to be able to teach these lessons to the people. That's what I meant. I didn't mean to deliteralize it.
No, absolutely. Okay. And it's a great model because the overflowing of riverbanks and destroying of houses and people's lives and animals was a big devastation of those times. And that would make them think about, why am I here? What's the purpose of life? Right. What's the responsibility of human protection? Right? That goes on today. And by the way, people don't realize, but with ecological change, the big issue today is that people who live near seas, right, are the ones that are most likely to be damaged. Like, we're middle class, more comfortable, we're going to be fine. But the poorer people who are living in these places, it's already happening now. They're whole areas are being covered with water. To quote Moby Dick, he said, don't think the flood is over. 2/3 of the earth is yet covered in water. Right? There's the threat of that. And so our responsibility to protect the life near the water's edge is important. So that's why the flood becomes the best story for it. For devastation.
Yeah, and I also think it's not just the fact that, like Bensi said, they're using established stories in order to teach us lessons through narrative, but it's also through rituals. We see, like, if we follow the Rambam when he talks about why sacrifice was adopted by the Torah, it's also taking an established norm and kind of redirecting humanity towards a different goal, different purpose.
Very good point.
It's true. And every teacher knows you do that story. By the way, that's my theory of why it's called Moreh Nevuchim, right? Because the word navoch only occurs once in the Torah, and that's why they were lost coming out of Egypt, right? They what Pharaoh would have said, and they're lost in the desert. And Maimonides, as you said in that very chapter, says, look, I'll prove to you that you have to go the long way around and gradually move people, because the Bnei Yisrael weren't taken directly to Israel. So I think he even gets the title of the book from that way, right? That growth requires moving through perplexity to gradually getting there. Absolutely.
So we want to move on to a different tangent in the area of faith. I think that these two chapters that we want to talk about, it was a pleasure reading. I feel that if anyone says that they don't have a problem with emunah, with faith, they're lying. If not to people, then to themselves. Because the reality is, we're human beings. We're somewhat always going to be in the dark. And these are things that we have to deal with. And I think that by having the courage to deal with these problems instead of just running away from it and just saying, oh, I'm a believer, you might be a believer, but what does that even mean to you? Right. I think these chapters were very important, and I am excited to get into this. So to begin with, what does it mean to believe in God?
Yeah, so I mean, I didn't begin the book in this way because for me, faith is an adult issue. So I began with the basic issues of science, the physical world that we're in, and then I did moral issues, and the last section is about faith. And I didn't call it, here's how you believe in God. I was like, what does it mean to believe in God? What is belief? What does that mean? What's our relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu? And I tried to go through it and reject all these kind of proofs for God, which I really don't like, which aren't compelling. And even if you think some of them kind of work, maybe, which I don't think they really do, they don't get you into a close relationship with the HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? Most you'll get is that there is a creator, but not that they know what you do and interact in this world. The proofs for God don't really help there. So I kind of go past that quite quickly. But then what I also do, which is important, is show that the disproofs for God don't work.
Yeah.
Right? That's really important realization, that those are just as many holes. And therefore, the whole idea of proof is the wrong way of looking at it. I mean, I talk about this. If I say, can I prove I love my wife? That love is not an issue that can give you a scientific proof. I can try and show you. So I live through a relationship. And that's what I focus on, the issue of relationship, right? In the same way that one of the 10 commandments is honor your parents. And, do I honor my parents? Yes or no? It's not a black and white. I try. I work on the relationship. And the same with God. And so I talk about relationship on a very deep level. I try and argue that this is key. So when Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah talks about Abraham coming to find God, well, you'd think, the Mishnah Torah is a book of law. But at the beginning of the laws of idolatry, he gives you a story of how Abraham found God. It's a very long story. What's it doing there? It's like if you read, in England, we have something called the Highway Code you have to study to pass your driving test. The Highway Code doesn't tell you the story of how cars were invented. It just tells you the rules of driving. So why does Maimonides tell you the origin of idolatry in the world and how Abraham found God? And so someone says to me, oh, it's because he believes in God, Abraham, so you should. But that can't be why, because it's a very long chapter. I think what the Rambam is doing is saying, here is the story of Abraham's journey. Here's the quest he went on to find God. First, he rejects idolatry and all the fake stories. So you have all these stories of laughing at his dad's idol shop. So, the first stage of growth isn't to know the truth, but it's to know what's false. So you clearly don't believe in idolatry. And then gradually he finds this path of the Derech Hashem, the way of God. And that for me becomes the model, right? That it's actually something you gain as you mature in relationships. And that's a very important issue to me. Maimonides says, just like you might fall in love with your partner and think about them always and can't eat or sleep because you think about them so much, so you should love God even more. Now, when I first read that, it's the end of Hilchot Tshuva, Laws of Repentance, I was shocked. Like, how can you compare physical attraction and erotic touching love with spiritual high level of God love? But for Maimonides, it's similar because it's about relationship, reaching out to another. So then I get into what is relationship? How do we interact with the world? And this is why I got really excited by my science, because if you look at biology and if you look at psychology, and if you even look at the way fundamental physics, that all of existence is in a dance of relationship. It's not individualized. We think that we're separate from the world and that there's me and there's the world out there. But it's a pleasant lie. The truth of it, and the more you study biology, you see this of psychology, that actually we only know our existence through interaction, through relationship. And for me, that's the path to God. The quest to God is to understand the depth of relationship. So, your mind, if you were brought up in a place where you didn't meet any other people and you weren't taught language and you were hardly shown the light of day, your brain literally would not develop. Your brain would be literally less developed. You only develop your consciousness through interaction, through realization. That's what the world is, interacting. So relationship is more fundamental than what is in a relationship. And that's why, it says in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, anytime people sit together and are learning, then the divine presence is amongst them.
Yeah.
Because they're in a relationship. So that's literally how we understand HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, if you want to get me very technical of what is the nature of existence of God and so on, I'm not an expert, I'm not a philosopher. And the Rambam does get into it, as you know, in chapter 3 of the third section of the guide. But what I was trying to show is that the way the Torah talks about God is what you're in relationship with, and that you need to work on that relationship. Right? And someone says to me, well, but how do I know God exists? So I'll say, when you're in a relationship with somebody, sometimes you doubt the relationship and think, do I even have a relationship? But then you go back and work on it to see where are we on a relationship. And that's what you need to do, to think about that,
One of the things that you mentioned, and I believe the beginning of the chapter, I think you touched upon this right before you got into the relationship part. A lot of people get stuck on the proofs and disproofs of God. It's like it almost becomes academic. Can you prove? So you have all the different, like for me personally, the cosmological argument when I was a child was to me the intuitive argument that I kind of just accepted intuitively, notwithstanding the fact that it's not foolproof, right? But that's just for me as a child, the cosmological argument just kind of what I gravitated towards without even knowing that I was gravitating towards a cosmological argument. It's just how I thought about it. Like, well, there has to be like, a creator to all this, right? But the problem is, and what you mentioned in your book is when it's become so technical as a matter of proving that God exists or doesn't exist, that does not lend itself necessarily to the God of Israel, the personal God, the God of history, the God of Israel, the God of the Torah. And I think that we spend an inordinate amount of time, probably because we want to be able to answer the atheist, which is fine, right? But at best, at the very, very best, what you're getting is an Aristotelian type of God. At the very, very best, at the proof or close to proof level, right? And I think that it's missing the boat completely, because the goal is not to just prove that there was a creator to the world. The goal is to, how do we enter a relationship with that creator? And I think that's what's getting lost. And there's a lot of people that are brilliant, and there's a lot of people that have incredible, they can go on for hours with, why is this proof better or not better? You can get involved with all these things, but at the end of the day, the point of Judaism is not to prove a creator, it's to be in a relationship with that creator. With that being said, what is your take on how should we approach the relationship with the creator? I
talk a little bit about language in the book, but it's like any subject to an extent. So you might want to have a relationship with Shakespeare or with cinema or with wine tasting or a new experience. So you have to experience it and be involved in it. You might come away and say, there's nothing to this, right? There's nothing. They all taste the same, all the whiskeys, all the cheeses taste. There's nothing to this, It's all just pretension. There's no such thing as art. You might spend years studying the different artists and art history and see the beauty. You might go, it's all just paint, it's meaningless. But what happens when you get involved in one area is you actually think, oh, there's actually depth to this. So for people who are skeptical, and by the way, my favorite line on this was Rabbi Sacks writes this in Morality when he's becoming more religious. And one of his professors says to him, Sacks, you're clearly very smart. How can you be religious? How can you believe in God? And he says, well, Professor, think of me as a lapsed skeptic, which I love. It's a great phrase, a lapsed skeptic. So I know there's lots of skeptics out there. So what I suggest they do, like any topic, engage in it. Engage in it. Engage in the God concept, as an idea. Experience it. See, if you're Jewish, what the religious practices are, and experience how we talk about God. Experience it, just like in the Gemara when this Roman leader couldn't understand Shabbos and he had to experience Shabbat. So experience what that relationship is, and you might discover a truth and a path in it that is beyond a concept to a reality, not an existence. I don't see God as a separate existence. I think that's limited, right? It's a limited use of language. It's more than that, but the concept becomes real. And what's interesting, as a scientist, it really helps because, for many years, we always talked about light as a metaphor for HaKadosh Baruch Hu, reality, right? That everything is really light. When I did my degree in physics and you learn what E equals mc squared really means, that all matter is frozen light, it turns out the metaphor is real. So I've experienced that as a scientist. Metaphorical ideas from the past turn out to actually have physical or be true on some level. And so I'm suggesting the same approach here. Live with the God concept, use the language, understand what Jews are doing, play with it, and deepen it. And gradually you'll begin to understand what this truth is, and then you might actually experience it. And surprisingly, Rav Soloveitchik was great here, right? You know, we will normally see him as this very rational and halachic man, but he wrote this book Vikashtem Misham at the same time as Learning Man of Faith in the 40s or 50s, whenever it was. But it was only published in Hebrew in the 80s and only translated in English in the 2000s. And when I was writing my book, I read it and I was like, and I read it again to really check. And he is really passionate about interacting with God. He said the cosmological will only get you so far. It won't give you faith. You have to see God reaching out to you. And he writes poetically, this man was a lover on fire with God. And it's really inspiring, but he goes through the arguments and explains to you how you can achieve this relationship. About seeking God. That encouraged me to look at how often the word lidrosh is used in the Torah, that we seek God, we seek an understanding of God. A great book you might want to read, but I'm sure you've come across James Krugel. So one of his last books, do I have it on the shelf? I've been looking at it recently. One of his last books is about understanding how to relate to God, or the experiences, encounters with God in the Torah. He analyzes them in great depth and looks at what people really thought they were thinking of when they used the word God. You know, and it's much more complex than just some person on a cloud or some vision. Right? The language, you know, the literary reading makes you look at it in a deeper way. And then I end the chapter by looking at a poem by Leonard Cohen, actually, about a belief. And even in the playfulness of the poem, you get a deeper idea of what relationship with God could mean. So I give suggestions of what to do. But as I said, I think start with the concept like any other topic and then put meat and bones on it. Obviously metaphorical because God's not physical, but you put meat on the bones and either it becomes real for you and important, or or not. And then you reject. I accept that. But I really believe that in the process, you find it meaningful.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to piggyback on what you're saying regarding the Torah itself. The first of the Ten Commandments is to know God. Knowledge is intimacy. It's a relationship. Versus there's no commandment to have any faith in God. It's faith. It almost feels like it's like a Christian idea that kind of we've been influenced by.
Well, you're right, but let's be really clear. It doesn't use the word emunah, but it also doesn't use the word da. Well, the Rambam does in his 13 principles. You have to know, but the Torah just says, "Anochi Hashem lakecha." I'm the Lord your God, you brought the other land of Egypt. So you know me through you're right in that you know me because I related to you. I did something for you. I'm the guy that took you out of Egypt.
Right,
it's an experience. I'm not the creator. That's later. That's a separate. I'm the person that did something for you. So do something for me. It's a relationship.
And it makes sense because any relationship is really about experience, because you can't intellectualize a relationship. That's just not what a relationship is. A relationship is something that you experience, that you go into. So to be able to, it's not a mathematical equation, and it's not something that you could just conceptualize. These things serve almost as a barrier to some extent, because when it's too much about conceptualizations and keeping it, let's just call it like hyper rational in a sense, there's nothing to go off of. You have to actually immerse yourself in the
I completely agree, but let's be honest, and this is what I always try and do, is that what's the danger with this approach is that you can have a relationship with anything. And this is what the atheists say. So let's say I want to relate to unicorns, right? Or imagine that Star Wars is real. And I read those things and I get excited by it and I live by it, the code of Star Wars, or unicorns being if I do certain things, and it becomes meaningful for me, and then it becomes real. I know it's real for people. They dress up. They spend their whole lives. So the danger, and I'll challenge you to answer this. What the atheists will say to you is that, fine, if I relate something that isn't ultimately true, I might enjoy it and have a nice experience about it, but I'm not nearer to reality. I'm just in a fantasy world. It might be meaningful for me. I might enjoy it. I might meet my partner at a cosplay of Star Wars, but it's not real.
Which is why,
and that's the danger of this relationship approach. So how would you respond to that?
Putting me on the spot, but which is why, again, it always comes down to balance. It always comes down to balance. But I would say that well, what I was trying to say was it cannot be exclusively
Mm,
about conceptualizations,
mm.
meaning if that's all you're engaged in, it's good, but it's never going to lead to the relationship. On the
Mm.
flip side, like you said, if it's only about relationship to the, like in a blind type of relationship way and completely like, divorced from, so then you're getting, imagination.
Well,
Which,
that's the thing. Ultimate divorce from reality, and this is the key. The Torah doesn't take place on Middle Earth, right, or Tatooine, right,
Narnia.
or Narnia. Exactly. It takes place on the same Earth that we're in now, with places you can identify. So it does tie it back to reality in a very important way, and that's a big difference. But I always like to pull apart my arguments, right, when I'm just excited about them, because it's important to do that, because it's called confirmation bias, which we always do. It's about by talking together, completely convinced something is true. But we need to try and be the person that's challenging us. And I spent so much time with people asking questions. They're always in my head. They go, "Okay, Rafi, but I did this actually podcast with two very questioning students for exactly that reason." So it keeps you on your toes. So you get excited about it, and then you really believe it's true. So you have to jump with those issues as well, which is it's another
noted.
side of it. Yes, absolutely.
I will take that as a
Yeah,
lesson for the future.
yeah. No, it's good for all of us to do it.
Noted.
It's all of us to do. Yeah.
Um,
All right, so we wanted to get into the last segment, which is what if you still have difficulties?
Yeah, but I'll tell you, this is the chapter I wanted to write from the beginning. Right, but how could an Orthodox rabbi say it's okay if you're not sure you believe in God, because let me give you other things of reasons to be religious, right? And you can't write that, right? So I wanted to show that actually I do have an understanding of belief, but I wanted to show people that if they have difficulty, some people just they don't have a spiritual bone in their body. They're just rational, objective, and they just see what's real in front of them, and they find it hard to be spiritual. Sometimes they find it hard to build relationships as a result. Not always, but sometimes their partner's the same, so it doesn't matter. But some people just can't think in that way, or have difficulty, or have hung-ups from childhood with good reason on aspects of religiousness that they find difficult. They can't relate to a God in that way. So I wanted to show them that our faith, which is 3,000 years old, actually a lot's come along the way as well. And that the word faith, emunah, is much more about loyalty to a cause than objective belief in a being.
It's
And I
faithful.
yeah, faithfulness
Yes.
rather than faith, or affiliation more than affirmation is a nice way of saying it as well. And I get that from look up the way the word emunah is used. Emunah means law. Last week's Sedra. I mean, I know this will come out later, but we just read Ki Tavo, right? Which has got all the tochacha, all the rebukes that God gives. And the word emunah occurs there. I was looking on Shabbat. It's fascinating. It says, and God says, and because you acted badly, I will give you makot emunah. I will give you faithful wax. Well, why does he use the word faith there? Because it means that you did this, I'm definitely going to punish you. I will be consistent and be loyal, and you can get you for what you did. I'm going to play out the punishments. So the word emunah is used all the time to mean loyal, reliable, faithful to something, right? And I compare it to citizenship. I might not agree with all of Britishness, right, or all aspects of it, or like the king particularly. But as a British subject, I'm loyal to the country. That's what it means. I don't necessarily believe or understand all its history, but I'm loyal to this country. And there are Jews out there. I'll give you an example. I don't know if you've heard of the philosopher Isaiah Berlin. He's a very important philosopher in terms of understanding of freedom. And he wasn't a particularly religious man. And when he was very ill, he gave the message to Rabbi Sacks, I'd like you to do my funeral, right? To do the Levaya. And Rabbi Sacks spoke beautifully, and he said, Isaiah Berlin might not have been a very religious Jew, but he was a loyal Jew. Very loyal Jew, and that takes you a long way. So Isaiah Berlin defended Israel. He did wonderful, wonderful things. And is it for me to say that if you're not sure you understand God, you're less of a Jew than someone who fights the Jewish people? There's soldiers who are fighting for Israel now. And I met them recently, by the way, and I talked about God with them. There's some wonderful conversations. But if they're not sure they believe in God, they believe in Am Yisrael, they believe in this people. They believe in the project. Here's what I say. They believe in the project of Am Yisrael. Now, part of that project is belief, but you might not have understood that bit of the project, right? You might not get it. You might understand just one part of it. And so that's okay. And so the chapter is about, if you're not sure what you believe, that's okay. I prove I prove, I argue very, I think convincingly, that halachically you're going to get accepted. And I quote lots of sources about that you're never going to get rejected. Even the Rambam says you might be a sinner, you might have done wrong, but you're still a Jew. You have to go a very long way to get rejected. You have to stand up in public and say, for sure, I'm 100% convinced that there is no God and I can't believe in God and I reject this and I'm not part of the Jewish people. If you go that far, then maybe you're in trouble. But most people are just not sure, right? And that's okay. And I show them that faith is much more about caring for Am Yisrael than objective belief in God. And the best proof, I think, is Moshe. Because if anyone knew the reality of God, it was Moshe Rabbeinu. The Torah says it. No one knew a God like Moshe face to face. And yet he's the one person in the Torah, right, gets punished, right? Because you didn't believe me. So how could anyone know? I mean, Moshe knew God existed. That's no question about that. So how could I punish because you didn't believe me? Believe in me. You weren't faithful to me. That's the issue that Moshe fails, right? And that's why we sing that song, Ma'aminim b'nei Ma'aminim. We're believers, children of believers. And Rabbi Sacks would often say that to me, right? What does that mean? It means that they might not be religious, but they're believers. They're part of the Jewish people. And those guys standing outside doing security, those Jews who defend Israel in so many ways and fight for us, they might not be particularly religious or, but they are deeply, deeply connected to Am Yisrael. And that is a deep, deep emunah. And it's very, very powerful. And I historically show that Achav, who's the perfect example of rejecter, King Ahab, was also part of this. So I show there's a great tradition of people challenging God and yet being part of Am Yisrael. So that's what that chapter is really about, that faith is a much more complex idea. And we've been, I won't use the word poison, but we've been over-influenced by Christian ideas of objective knowledge of God. That's not the way Jews work. We never do that. You never get tested of your beliefs in that way.
Absolutely.
That's not how we work.
And speaking of Rabbi Sacks, this comes up often, but one of my favorite quotes of his is, faith is the courage to live with uncertainty. So, I find that to be such a powerful statement.
Well, I was very honored. Like, he encouraged me to write, and he never got to see the final book, but his daughter, Gila Sacks, wonderfully, she was my student, and she wrote the introduction to the book. And she has a wonderful introduction. It's very nice. And she quotes her father at the very beginning, which says, we question not because we doubt, but because we believe. Like, we believe that there'll be answers. We believe that I can trust. So I'm never afraid to question the Torah, because I think there'll always be answers, because I've got that deep belief underneath it. So absolutely. And in the one fell swoop with that line, she kind of justified what I was trying to do in the book. And what I'm trying to say, that we have a questioning belief. It's not that we question. We have a questioning belief. Questioning, as you mentioned earlier, deepens our relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu to really understand me. If someone said to me, I really like your book, I go, okay. But if someone goes, I realize, but I especially like this, I wasn't sure about that. And then I'm arguing and conversing with about that. Do I prefer that, or someone just going, it's fantastic, and they're not talking to me about it? I want them to engage, even if it means challenging. That idea that, even, a bad review is better than no review. So that's what questioning is. HaKadosh Baruch Hu much prefers us arguing with him than not caring about it. Just walking away, being apathetic. That's the worst, where no one really cares anymore. That's the sad thing.
I think questioning is like maybe the most fundamental value of Judaism, because you ask a random person about Jews, they'll say like, oh, Jews love to argue. And we have the Talmud, which is all recorded arguments, and we have the four sons on Pesach who ask questions and challenge. We're teaching our children from young age the importance of questioning, because we're trying to refine our understanding of the world. And by just accepting things and not questioning things, we can never get to that point. So I think,
and that's why my introduction, which I write a lot about questions, I've got this great line which I found in a kind of Rashi on the Gemara Kedushin, where Banazai would you stand in the marketplace and say, Hareni patuach u'muchan l'hashiv l'shali. I'm ready and willing to answer any question someone has in Torah. And I remember reading that Rashi and thinking, oh, that's so fantastic, because it feels like what I'm doing is what Chazal always did. Like, like in a market, you have all different kinds of shops. You had the question shop with the rabbi going, come on, ask me. I'm ready. I'm muchan. I want you to do that. And when I saw Rashi saying Chazal did it, I felt really it's okay what I'm doing. I'm meant to be doing this. I'm trying to deepen Yirat Shamayim as opposed to, and it means unpacking things and challenging things and doing it honestly. But I really believe that the process will get us somewhere more interesting at the end.
Absolutely. Even in a relationship, asking questions, going on when you go on a date, the less questions you ask, the less you're going to know.
Yeah.
You need to constantly ask and get to the bottom of things and understand, you know, that's how you build intimate relationships.
Yeah. There's timing, there's certain times to be quiet and not to be nudging and ask questions, and just experience. And that's like Yom Kippur, certain days of the year, it's not a day to ask. You want to be inside something, and then other times you do it. It's a complex relationship. I'll give you an example of it, actually. I'll get political because I think it's okay to do that. It was I used to be a educator of all different youth movements, religious and different denominations. And there was a shaliach from a non-Orthodox denomination who was very left-wing about Israel. Israeli guy, served in the army, but very left-wing about the government and very critical, all that kind of stuff. We had lots of debates about things. But I remember once, it was Yom HaZikaron, right? The day before Yom HaTzmaut, when we were remembering the Israeli soldiers. And I said to him, are you going to make a comment about soldiers and the army and everything? And he looked at me and he goes, Lo hayom, not today. And his face was dead serious. It was like he's saying, look, I challenge Israel, but I 100% support my country and I believe in it. And this is a day where I'm remembering the soldiers that died. Don't you start trying to wind me up. And I made a mistake. I apologized to him. I misunderstood him, that actually had this deep connection. And he would challenge things, but challenging doesn't mean I don't love it or I don't fight for it. I won't die for it. And it was a very moving moment. I realized there's a time to question, in the relationship. And sometimes, enjoy, drink a bit, sing a bit, dance a bit, and the date. And other times, as you say, ask about the person. But so questioning is part of faith, but it's not every bit of it. But without it, you can't get deeper. I 100% agree.
And sadly, I think we live in an era right now that people are not asking anymore. They're making decisions on emotions or whatnot. I think that asking questions is so fundamental. Like I said before, it's so fundamental to knowledge. Forget about Jewish knowledge, knowledge of the world. And I hope that your book inspires other people to continue to ask questions so they can deepen their understanding of God and the world. So just once again, we want to hold up the book, Questioning Belief, and we wanted to thank you so much for coming on the podcast. This was a real absolute pleasure to have you on. Betsy, if you have any.
Incidentally, what you just said before is I guess that's the answer towards the question you asked me before, if I'm not mistaken, right? So there's experience, but then the questioning and all that part, the conceptualize, all serves to deepen that experience.
Yes, and you have to engage, and so it's what we encourage people to do, to kind of do things to play out. Absolutely. So no, it was hard to write the book and to get the right balance. And I've got some people phoned me and said, "Oh, picked up your book. It's another one of these outreachy books. Like, I'm going to convince you," which you can't help it. Like, it looks like that. He said, "But you know what? When I began to read it, I realized you weren't doing that." And I was like, "Oh, great, you engaged. That's fine." So, you always have a preconceived idea of something, but when you get into it, I'm trying to do something new and original and helpful, and I hope it is. And thank you for engaging with me about it and promoting it. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. No, this is not a standard apologetics book. This is a book that tries to give a fresh new eyes towards certain topics and give a direction from which every Jew, no matter where he's at, to be able to engage and experience and learn and discover and seek. And we really, really appreciate you coming on. The book is great. We are looking forward to more publications soon, God willing, from you, and hope that you would come back on to discuss your future projects, because this was great. This is up our alley, and we couldn't appreciate it more.
And we don't expect it so much from Magid. Magid is just, they keep knocking out of the park.
Yeah,
Magid. The fact that we saw that it was written by Magid, we knew that it's not one of those cookie cutter hero books. And
I think they're a great publisher. They really helped me with it, so I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Wonderful meeting you. B'atzlacha with the podcast. You interview great people. I've listened to quite a few of them, a lot of my heroes, and keep going. B'atzlacha.
Thank you so much. And we want to give one thank you to Daniel Jonas, who was a guest on our podcast, a friend of ours, who suggested we interview, and it was a great suggestion. So
yeah, Daniel's great for keeping me real and down to earth about things. He's good for poking holes in bad arguments,
Oh
which I
yeah,
like.
Daniel. All right, thank you so much, and Shavua Tov.
Be well. Thank you so much, and have a good year. Shana Tova for the coming months as well. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.